Good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thanks so much for joining us on especially what is looking to be an increasingly gloomy evening for our event on Trump Administration 2.0, From Policy Intent to Consequence. I'll explain that title and more in just a moment. I'm Nazneen Barma. I'm the director of the Scrivener Institute of Public Policy here at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, where I'm also a professor and associate dean. It's wonderful to have so many people from the Scrivener, Corbell, and University of Denver communities here with us tonight. We're looking forward at the end of our panel to engaging in a conversation with you all when we'll turn to questions. But I wanted to preface my introductions of my colleagues up here and the panel just by saying it's been 22 days since President Trump was inaugurated to his second term in office. He and his allies promised us to flood the zone, that they would flood the zone, and indeed they have, with a number of a number is an understatement, I think. Flood of executive orders, pardons for allies, investigations of perceived enemies and people in the federal bureaucracy, hiring freezes, funding freezes, the potential shutdown of large government agencies, and indeed of funding sources for research universities and other research entities around the country. We're living through an incredibly confusing, tumultuous, and as much as the word is often overused, I think it's safe to say this is truly an unprecedented time with dramatic consequences emerging in terms of public policy, which we're here to discuss today, and indeed the state of American democracy. I think it's important to state, too, that this is also an emotional time. The consequences seem likely to affect everyone. If not personally, then certainly in terms of the impact on the communities that we inhabit, from the global to the local. And as much as we may feel unmoored by how rapidly that is all unfolding, it's important to grapple with what is actually going on and what might happen as a result. It's certainly the case that some of the things that the Trump administration and its allies have undertaken over the last 3 weeks are illegal and potentially unconstitutional. Those matters are being adjudicated by the courts as we speak. And probably in the 30 seconds that I have been speaking, something else has happened that we don't really know about yet. So this is dramatically fast moving. But the goal of our panel today was to start to talk about the things that we are experts on. And I use the word expert intentionally. One of the things that, again, the Trump administration and its allies have sort of intentionally tried to do is to undermine different forms of expertise. We are at a university. We have experts on faculty, and I'm delighted to welcome them to the stage today to talk about the issues that they are expert on. We're not going to be able to even scratch the surface of all the many things that are happening that occupy us, but we are going to have the benefit of listening to these four wonderful scholars about the things that they know about. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. Rebecca Galemba is professor here at the Corbell School and co-director of the Center for Immigration Policy and Research. She's an anthropologist by training who focuses on globalization, illicit markets, and migration and the intersection of all those things, and does a great deal of community-engaged work on migration here in Denver. Professor Eileen Grable, to her left, at the far end, is distinguished university professor, an economist here at the Corbell School, and the co-director of the Global Economic Affairs Program. Eileen is an expert on international financial policy, global financial governance, et cetera. Fritz Mayer, some of you may know, is the dean of the Corbell School. It's a pleasure to have him here in his capacity as professor of public policy. He is here to talk to us about climate policy, international trade, and international security. And to my immediate left is Professor Govind Prasad, who is an associate professor of law with the Sturm College of Law. He's a law scholar with a particular interest and focus on bioethical the intersection of bioethical issues and distributive justice, and has focused his recent research and engagement at the intersection of health law and policy. I wanted to give a special thanks to Professor Grable, who in many ways provided the inspiration for this event and sort of wanting to discuss with students and colleagues about some of the things that she's been hearing about. And a particular thanks to Katie Aker, Assistant Director of the Scrivener Institute, whose admirable organizational skills get us all here. Thanks, Katie. Let me start. I'm going to get right into it. One of the things that we all remember hearing about, ad nauseum for those of us who were paying attention at the time during the campaign and during the run-up to the election, was tariffs. And, they're back in the news. As President Trump promised, one of the first things that he was going to undertake was to impose tariffs on a range of different countries for a range of different reasons. And indeed, yesterday, he announced the imposition of a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports. I'm going to ask you, Eileen, to help us understand. First of all, perhaps you can help us understand the logic behind the Trump approach to tariffs, what the sort of stated intent is, what you perceive to be the sort of underlying intent, and then ask you to talk about some of the consequences. And that, again, is the sort of the conceit behind this whole panel that we're going to kind of discuss. What is the Trump administration trying to do? What is actually going to happen as we see it? Eileen, over to you, please.
Okay, many thanks. I just want to note I had to kind of dust off my graduate school notes about international trade. It's not an area I actually follow very closely since I focus on the international financial system, so it's been fun for me to take a dive back into the world of international trade. With that in mind, I want to note that President Trump has always called himself a tariff man, right? That's a phrase that he likes to use to describe his worldview on many occasions. And he's been arguing since his first electoral campaign and obviously during the more recent campaign that tariffs will play many positive roles for the U.S. and that they're a kind of win-win for the U.S., a source of easy money in his view. He makes a couple of arguments on behalf of tariffs. One is a kind of state power argument that aligns with his Make America Great Again kind of broad message and rhetoric. So he sees tariffs as an instrument for regaining what he sees as lost American power. He sees tariffs as a tool for the reindustrialization of the United States and for reshoring the kinds of manufacturing prowess that the U.S. used to have, and which he sees as a loss. He sees tariffs as a way of promoting employment in export-oriented sectors in the U.S. He sees them as a key to robust economic growth, as a solution to what he falsely claims is a kind of malaise that hangs over the U.S. economy. He sees them as a source of revenue that could be used to close the U.S. federal budget deficit. They're a kind of cure-all for many ills in Trump's worldview. He also sees tariffs as a kind of corrective for what he often claims are unfair practices vis-a-vis the U.S. Relative to other nations. And so they're also a way of kind of correcting what he sees as unfair practices, settling scores with other countries. So there are a great many reasons why President Trump has made a case for tariffs during his career as a presidential candidate, now as president. I'll also note that tariffs, I think, are often seen as a kind of red meat for President Trump's base. Tariffs are really easy to market to a general public that's craving easy solutions to what are really complicated and long-standing problems. And I think tariffs in that sense score well in the court of public opinion as a kind of quick fix that's been very satisfying to the supporters of Trump's. So that's the case that he's made. We have a kind of natural experiment, which we don't often have in the social world, because President Trump, during his first term in office, imposed tariffs, including tariffs on steel and other metals like aluminum. And there's been a lot of research on the effects of those tariffs. What we know happened in terms of those tariffs, just first on the economic level, and then we can talk about international relations a little bit. But on the economic level, the tariffs against steel and aluminum during Trump 1.0 did have the effect of increasing manufacturing output on the part of the U.S. steel and aluminum community, workers in those firms, investors in those firms, and the firms themselves did see some expansion of output. That's the plus side of the balance sheet. However, on the minus side of the balance sheet, which is actually a much larger side of the balance sheet, what we saw was that the downstream industries, that is to say, those industries which use steel and aluminum as an input to their production, suffered greatly. The losses by all of the downstream industries were much greater than the benefits that were enjoyed by the manufacturers of steel and aluminum, and by those downstream industries. Just some examples: heavy machinery, tractors, washing machines, refrigerators, construction industry, light tools, food storage, like all of the tin cans that have aluminum as one of their components in their construction, the automobile industry. All of those industries suffered losses as a consequence of those tariffs. So we know that happened in Trump 1.0. We also know now, looking ahead, that tariffs are inflationary. Tariffs increase the cost of goods that are sold both as inputs to firms that produce other things like automobiles and construction machinery and tools and tractors, but they also figure into the costs of housing and many things that consumers buy. All of the good economic forecasts on the effects of the kinds of tariffs that Trump has implemented and those that he has toyed with implementing, because we know there's been one step back, tariffs have been announced and then rolled back, they're threatened again. There's likely to be many more tariffs to come. Those tariffs will raise prices in the US for both producers and consumers. And that's, of course, important because inflation is already a political issue. It was a political issue that played an important role, I would argue, in the presidential election. It's an important issue at the grocery checkout counter for ordinary Americans. And so the fact that President Trump's main economic policy is the promotion of tariffs is one that's very likely to increase inflation. Other negative effects that I'll just mention briefly, if that's all right. Tariffs not only have effects on inflation in the country, they have negative effects on the performance of all of these downstream industries and employment in downstream industries. That matters a lot. Tariffs also are very likely to raise the value of the dollar. That is to say, cause the dollar to appreciate relative to other countries in the world. That, in turn, as students of international finance know, when a country's currency appreciates in value relative to other currencies, it makes all of their exports more expensive, so it discourages the purchase of their exports. It makes imports cheaper, and so Americans who already have an appetite for the purchase of imported goods are likely to import more with a stronger dollar, export less because U.S. goods as a whole will become more expensive. And so that's another factor that actually will widen the trade deficit rather than reduce the trade deficit. There are many other effects of tariffs, and I'll just mention one other in the political arena. Tariffs cause our allies and our adversaries not to trust the United States. The U.S. is no longer at the center of the international trade system. The U.S.'s commitment to live up to its obligations under, let's say, the U.S.-Canada, the MCA, which was the agreement that NAFTA evolved into, that no longer really matters. Other trade agreements that the U.S. has signed really matter much less. And these tariffs are also causing many other countries in the world to develop an international trade system that runs rings around the U.S. There's been a spate of bilateral and multilateral trade agreements that don't involve the U.S. That's been happening since Trump 1.0. just in these early days of Trump 2.0, there has been a huge spate of new bilateral and multilateral trade agreements that have been signed because the U.S. is seen to be so erratic, so untrustworthy. And that goes for our allies like Canada and Mexico, Germany, the U.K., Ireland, South Korea, Japan, many of the U.S.'s greatest friends in the arena of international relations, but also our adversaries. I think the tariffs are a great gift to the Chinese government in particular. And so for those who are worried about Chinese power in the global economy, the tariff wars that the U.S. is starting, I think, are a great gift and a great source of fuel. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Eileen, for kind of a very clear and specific set of consequences in terms of the policies that are being enacted. And I think also, implicitly, and I just want to make this explicit, a really wonderful rendering of the fact that it's not just the actual consequence, the material consequences of a policy that has impact. It's also the anticipated consequences and the ways in which the perceived targets and sort of other stakeholders are kind of reacting to even just the threat or the perception of a potential policy has a set of impacts. And so, Fritz, I'm going to kind of turn to you and kind of invoking again your kind of public policy scholarship to kind of help us understand the same type of logic which at our Denver Democracy Summit a couple of weeks ago, Roger Pielke referred to as the concept of policy causality, right? How do we think about, as scholars and as people who think about public policy, communicating how policies have impacts and consequences to the people who are voting on their kind of anticipation of what those consequences might be? And I want to turn to question about sort of climate policy. The Trump administration in its first few days unveiled a series of executive orders, the kind of mandate to drill more oil and gas under the assertion that there's a national energy emergency, all the way to the decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement and other global agreements. So I would ask you to reflect on the consequences of that and help us think that through.
Thank you, Naz. Before we do that, I just wanted to share my general view. This was a gift I just got from Singumbe, and I think it really summarizes my point here, which is, you can read it. It says, Hakuna Matata, no worries. Well, where to start? Things have not been going great for the climate to begin with. At a first approximation, this is the curve of CO2 emissions, or CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And it is true that in the first few, in the rhetoric leading up to the election and now in the first few days, quite a dramatic set of actions or proposed actions, executive orders. I'll say a bit about where we're likely to land, but obviously the first thing that happened, or one of the first things that happened, was to withdraw from the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the international process. We did that once before. We've seen this before. Again, to be clear, that process is not working all that well, and so let's start with that caveat. Nonetheless, this is problematic at the global level. Without the U.S. there, it becomes more difficult for most countries to make commitments. The whole process of making commitments, which has been the centerpiece of the climate regime, that is, countries making commitments to reduce their carbon emissions, is really quite undermined by the U.S. absence. And I would add a very particular piece of this, which has become central in the conversations, which is climate financing. This is the demand by developing countries that there be funds made available to help them both mitigate and adapt to climate change. And it's become kind of a quid pro quo for participation in the whole process. And obviously that, as a form of foreign aid essentially is dead in the water right now from the U.S. And without the U.S. there, that makes it more difficult for other countries to make the same kind of commitment. So that process, which was already pretty weak, if any of you followed the COP29, so there's a 29th time we've gathered, the last one in Azerbaijan, in fairness, didn't really accomplish a whole lot. But this is not helpful. Now, coming closer to home, what you're seeing is every possible way to reverse anything that they can in this space. I mean, that's only a slight overstatement, but it's a series of executive orders ranging from reduction, stopping funding for NOAA research right now, withholding funds from the Inflation Reduction Act, which was funding efforts to, for example, to speed up electrification and the like, efforts to undermine a whole set of regulatory actions of the Biden administration and before to limit carbon reduction, efforts to promote drilling. There's a great irony there, by the way. Most of you know the U.S. is now, by far, the world's largest producer of fossil fuels. Actually, that sector is doing very well, thank you. But nonetheless, an effort to roll back regulations that encourage wind, questions about the speed with which the federal government will permit, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can look at the people who've been put in place in EPA and other key agencies. And I would say that, in the spirit of what of Eileen's generous introduction, what is the purpose of this? From their perspective, it is to undo excessive regulation, which in their minds have hampered the U.S. economy and the business. So it's a very pro-business deregulatory team that's being put in place, and they're looking for, right now, anything they can figure out to do. We talk further about the effects of, the power of the courts. There are challenges all over the place. There's administrative processes that typically need to be followed. What's little unclear is whether they're going to follow those administrative processes, whether DOJ will follow injunctions to continue funding things, et cetera. But it's going to be a very contentious period here over the next 4 years.
Thank you. I definitely want to come back to the last issue that you raised about sort of actions that could be taken by the various actors that could act, Congress, the courts, and so on and so forth. Before we do that, I want to turn to Govind to kind of stay at the level of kind of thinking about the potential consequences and impacts of different decisions. And another one that was announced in the first few days was a plan to withdraw from the World Health Organization. So Govind, you're one of our main campus experts. You were during the COVID pandemic. We're all aware that there is a potential of there is bird flu here in the United States, and there are people who are worried about the potential of an epidemic and potentially a pandemic. The Trump administration has also frozen, as far as I know. I mean, again, I looked this up 10 minutes ago. I'm not sure what has happened since. Funding to the National Institutes of Health and to research entities that work on different projects. This is in many ways a real sort of a frontal assault on data and information sharing. Help us understand what the logic might be there and some of the consequences, please.
Thanks. So I want to go through, there are such a substantial set of agencies and actors within U.S. health policy. And in fact, the actions that folks have mentioned already on the panel, tariffs, changes to environmental laws, also have implications for health. So people often describe those as ecological or social determinants of health. But let's focus more narrowly on the question that Naz is specifically pointing us to, which is thinking about, for instance, the implication of the, what the implications might be of withdrawal from the WHO. And again, you saw that it's not new. We saw that under Trump 1.0 already talked about, but not pursued through fully. And unlike some of the other actions that we've talked about so far, say in the environmental space, some of which are, I would say, legally ranging from very dubious to illegal because they stand outside the bounds of presidential power. Withdrawing from something like the WHO is actually something that is within the president's power to do. Presidents so far haven't. Now, you announce the intent to withdraw, and then I believe there's a 1-year period before that actually goes into effect. So there is a process, but some of these actions, especially in spaces related to foreign policy, are ones where the executive does have more leeway to do that. That's not saying that makes those policies a good idea, but I think it's useful to differentiate things that are really have no legal basis from things where you actually do have authority granted to the executive to do it. So looking at the, what the impacts of WHO withdrawal will be, I think what's particularly notable about that one is that that is something where the impacts, especially because of the delay between the announcement of withdrawal and actually withdrawing, and if you've actually seen, times I've looked at the news, sort of noises made by President Trump or others about, oh, maybe we would go back in if we could get a better deal from the organization. So also creates an environment of uncertainty that goes back to this theme of if there is uncertainty, it's hard to have reliance and to make a plan as global partners. But the effects of stating an intention to withdraw or threatening to withdraw or actually withdrawing from the WHO are not something that I think would be likely to be felt and traced to it immediately. What happens is that you are sort of taking down one important potential defense against something like the rise of a global pandemic. But like with some of these other policies that are talked about, it can be challenging, going to Naz's point about policy causation, to then be able to go back and conclusively say, this pandemic wouldn't have happened but for the decision to withdraw from the WHO. You can certainly say it made it more likely. In the way that you can also say that about various, for instance, hurricanes or weather phenomena, but it's with respect to, say, changes in energy or climate policy. But I think drawing that line of causation can be challenging. I think domestically, beyond the sort of potential of a bird flu pandemic, I don't know if folks have seen the stories in the news today about the TB outbreak in Kansas City. Domestically, I actually think one of the biggest threats that is happening now that I think has much less sort of clear legal basis than withdrawing from the WHO and maybe might be likely to have more immediate, although still harder to sort of decisively trace consequences, is the sort of taking down of health data, firing or withdrawal of support from public health and other agencies. So the CDC journal, for instance, has been it's been reported, has been told to sort of not disseminate data about bird flu transmission. And that's something where I think you could really clearly see a through line from that to a pandemic getting worse. And that flows not through, the threat to withdraw or the intention to withdraw from the WHO, but flows, and I think this will cut across a lot of the areas we're talking about, flows through another thing that's been going on that, again, I think is much more legally questionable, which is these inducements for qualified federal workers to resign, threats to withhold appropriated funding from, say, state-level agencies whose job it is to manage things like a TB outbreak, and also withdrawal of funding from programs within federal agencies that might seek to do that as well.
so much, Govind, for connecting for us the global, which we've been sort of which we started the panel discussing, directly more to the national and local levels, and of course the Scrivener Institute and Corbell School are concerned with these issues from the global to the local levels. I want to stay local and turn to Rebecca to talk about another hugely significant issue, especially for us here in the Denver metro area, migration. Rebecca, help us. From your perspective, understand what of the many executive orders and actions that the Trump administration has taken that will impact immigration. Some of them are kind of moves toward expedited removal. Well, there have been expedited removals as we've seen, the revocation of temporary protected status for 350,000 Venezuelan migrants, access to work permits, and so on. What, in your mind, are the most significant? If we can sort of parse that out, and what are you kind of anticipating are going to be the first set of things that we're really going to be kind of seeing in this space?
It just takes a second. Please cut me off because there were 10, I think, orders and proclamations made on day one, followed by many others. So I will try to just touch on a few of them. And if it's okay, I might get to the local implications later because I think there's so much else to cover. First of all, these came obviously, as you mentioned, like in a flurry, right? And they're meant to sow chaos. They're meant to sow panic. They're meant to sow terror. Some of them are obviously blatantly unconstitutional, right? Some are just plain irrational. Some legal experts say have so many basic errors in them they would fail a first-year law exam if you were to submit them to them. But some, I think, and those are the kind of scariest ones to me that actually are based in over 150 years of very limited a limited justice space for immigration, kind of in its racist history, plenary power, right, giving Congress and the executive a large degree of discretion over immigration with limited judicial review, many kind of laws that already actually exist that further armor these. We haven't talked a lot about the Lincoln Riley Act that Congress has passed, which just adds more kind of fuel to some of these.
Just lay that out just so that everybody knows what you're talking about.
Yeah, so this was, I believe it's still maybe waiting to be signed, but this is legislation that was just passed by Congress. It has two components. One that is mandatory detention without bond for non-citizens, I'm saying the words arrested for non-violent offenses. And that doesn't mean you did anything at all. It could be people who made errors. Some said maybe they didn't read the legislation because they said, oh, minors are fine. No, they're not. You don't even have to have been convicted. And again, that could be indefinite mandatory detention without bond, which has basically takes away due process entirely. Builds on some forms of detention we already have for certain kinds of crime, but never taken to this level. And then also has a component that allows states or attorney generals to sue the federal government for harm caused by immigration, which could really obviously strain a lot of resources, has a really dangerous precedent for the future, as well as the fact that immigration law is supposed to be the domain of the federal government and not of the states. So there's just a lot of issues that come with that as well. And I think, the one obviously that's the most blatantly unconstitutional would be obviously the birthright citizenship, which has been, judges have said that was probably the clearest thing I've ever blocked, but the DOJ appealed it today. You have these orders, and I think, what's really clear is if, I don't even like to say them, but if you read what they're called, you kind of see a very clear, right, agenda with these. What do they say they do versus what are they actually doing? You have the rhetoric of invasion mentioned in there, which one has no basis in reality at all, but was very clearly picking up on racialized tropes that have been used in the U.S. Southwest to kind of reinforce these reverse conquest narratives that have been happening for 150 years in that particular area of the country. You have ones kind of preserving, right, the meaning and value of American citizenship. Right? We really see those kind of clearly coming out of these. I think some of the most things that we will likely see is one, the one's called Protecting the American People Against Invasion, which is basically the max enforcement of immigration law. This basically takes up any priorities in terms of who's prioritized, right, for enforcement, which means basically anyone who's a recent arrival or is unauthorized is a potential target. An expansion of expedited removal. Why this is so problematic is, again, expedited removal has been in effect for quite some time, largely since the mid-90s. And in fact, asylum seekers are subject to expedited removal and detention until they pass their credible fear interview. But it had only been applied before within 100 miles of the border and within 14 days of arrival. Trump has expanded it to anywhere in the country as if you've been here for less than 2 years. And the onus is on you to prove that, right? So you could see the kind of who might be stopped and caught up in this. And again, the real problem with this, again, is that it takes due process away entirely. So it basically allows low-level kind of immigration officials to deport people without ever seeing a judge, without ever having the chance to make your case. The only defense would be to present a credible fear.
Good. Thanks so much. I know you have lots more to kind of contribute, and I want to come back. But I think you're making again a subtle but really important point about how there are sort of hints of precedent and legality, and sort of the question about sort of who gets to decide, the executive, Congress, or the courts, in all of the different issues that we've been talking about. I want to come to Eileen to kind of turn a little bit more to, again, sort of domestic policy, to ask about developments on that front. One of the things that I think we've never seen before and has no precedent is the takeover of the U.S. Treasury Department effectively, and the payment system specifically, by DOGE, the Department of Governmental Efficiency, which is not a government department, led by Elon Musk, who is not a federal government employee. What is going to happen here? Help us understand sort of the impacts on, regularized domestic economic policy, things that have been mandated by Congress, Social Security payments, the kind of basic business of the economy that gets done. What is going to happen if and when a sort of dismantling of these agencies from the inside really starts to take place?
I forgot about the microphone. It is unprecedented. So in this sense, we can't extrapolate from past historical experience with something as crazy as the DOGE takeover of the American government, right? We know, DOGE is a private sector advisory body that's been given unprecedented power. It's striking to me that, the name of this private sector advisory party is drawn from a cryptocurrency coin called Doge that had a picture of a dog, and it was issued as a joke by a cryptocurrency entrepreneur, but then in the craziness of the crypto market, it took off. And okay, this is the advisory body that is now trying to dismantle all of the important mechanisms of the American government. Of course, the first targets, were USAID, of course, the Treasury Department, which is what NASA asked about. The Treasury Department is hugely important. It's the financial plumbing of the U.S. economy. The Treasury Department makes about 90% of all of the payments on behalf of the federal government. So things like Medicaid, Medicare, veterans benefits, pensions, all payments to federal employees, payments to state and local governments, all of that flows through the Treasury Department. It's an immensely important part of the U.S. government. Of course, it has a tremendous amount of information about U.S. government contracting, information about private individuals, the fact that a group of what are mostly interns, it seems, 19 to 25-year-olds, or the staff that, the people that are filling out and filtering through the federal government agencies on DOGE's behalf now have access to confidential information that is threatening of personal privacy, that's immensely threatening of U.S. national security. And I think it's very important to remember that the U.S. Treasury Department is itself a foreign policy actor. It has tremendous foreign policy capabilities. This was a point made in a really wonderful essay by Goldgeiger and Saunders in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, where they rightly say we should think about the Treasury Department as an actor in the foreign policy world. Why? Well, one reason is it's the site where sanctions are initiated, monitored, and managed. Sanctions are a very important tool of statecraft in the U.S., an increasingly important and powerful tool. And so putting the Treasury Department in the hands of this group of interns and Elon Musk also threatens the U.S. sanctions program, which is a very important instrument, again, of national security, of public safety in the U.S. There's also one other issue, although, of course, there are a million things I want to mention, but I'll just mention one more. And that is, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. The fact that the takeover of this agency undermines legitimacy of the U.S. government, the credibility of its payment system, its ability to make payments, to protect privacy, to manage sanctioned behaviors, also makes the U.S. a much less credible ally in the world of international relations. And that, I think, plays a really important role in the U.S.'s ability to project its power and its legitimacy on the world stage. And maybe just one more thing I'll mention, there's also the issue of conflict of interest. Elon Musk is a business person. He has long positioned X and his companies as becoming a kind of multifaceted payment platform. The fact that he now has information about the payments and the business relationships that the U.S. government is involved in gives him a very significant competitive advantage that I would not put it past him to capitalize on. And so in that sense, it's a really gross violation of what we think of as conflict of interest norms within the United States.
Thanks so much, Eileen. I just want to say we have a few more minutes here. I'm going to kind of ask the other panelists just kind of one other question about domestic policy. We are going to have some time for Q&A, so be thinking about the questions that you might have for our panel that have been coming up for you. Govind, I want to come back to you to ask you about RFK Jr. And his nomination was advanced by the Senate Finance Committee and will be voted on likely this week by the full Senate. And it appears that he will be the next Secretary of Health and Human Services. Help us again understand, what can he genuinely sort of do legally as the new secretary in terms of things like vaccination schedules, and so on? What could he do legally versus what would be a similar sort of echo of the kinds of things that we're hearing about in other agencies that are kind of certainly questionable, if not outright illegal?
So I think the general theme is that agencies in particular, and this is an area where the courts have recently taken steps that in principle could be helpful in addressing malfeasance by somebody like RFK Jr. being in charge of an agency and making choices that are contrary to congressional intent for what that agency is supposed to do. So there's this longstanding doctrine that had courts defer to agencies' judgments when agencies were interpreting statutes. And the Supreme Court actually got rid of that doctrine in the most recent term and said, no, we don't defer anymore to the agency's interpretation of a statute. So they got rid of this old longstanding doctrine called the Chevron doctrine in a case called Loper-Bright. So I think what any agency head could do, say the Secretary of HHS, is going to be delimited by which things are actually within the Secretary's discretion. One thing that does come to mind as, again, I think you would need to look at the statute that authorizes these advisory committees that I think folks worry about is, could you stack the say, advisory committee on immunization practices? Now, those committees may already have members who have a certain term that you can't just get rid of, but could those committees be stacked in ways that populate them with members who don't have a factual scientific understanding of say, the benefits of vaccines? That certainly could be a very troubling result. I think to look at whether any of this would be legal, you would need to look at what the actual statutes were underlying the agency. So I'd imagine any sort of action taken by an agency that one could view as being arbitrary and capricious would be the kind of thing that you would see a lot of court challenges too. At the same time, you know, I think there are reasons to prefer courts interpreting statutes to sort of the unrestrained discretion of RFK Jr. interpreting statutes, but it also introduces a lot of uncertainty about how different courts are likely to come out in approaching these things. Something that's particularly just sort of confusing to me also about RFK Jr. as a figure is that the sets of positions that he's taken are quite eclectic and in some ways run not exactly parallel to the views of other folks within the administration. So for instance, the Biden administration suggested that agencies like Medicare should cover when medically indicated access to GLP-1 drugs for people with obesity who had a medical indication for that. And there are folks within the Trump, not Elon Musk is actually who I think of, who is not, as Naz is pointing out, any sort of agency official, but has spoken very positively about those drugs and their potential for benefit. RFK Jr., I think, has a rather different view of those medications. And so it'll be interesting to see, you know, if he is confirmed. And I think he's someone who really in his statements, I think it sort of stands out, just said a lot of things that were not matters of sort of policy debate, but were just false. I still hold out some hope that you may see, I mean, the Senate has a role in advising and has to consent on nominees. I'm interested in whether they're, you know, in the, you know, Trump 1.0, I think you did see some pushback against some nominees. Also, many of the nominees, I think, were better qualified. I think for RFK Jr., I think there are a lot of reasons to be concerned. Any reason for optimism, I think, to me, there comes from the courts and the fact that agencies don't just have discretion, they are governed by statutes and by their own regulations. And I think that's where you'd be likely to see a lot of action.
Thanks, Governor. Two really important and subtle insights there. One is that, you know, the so-called MAGA coalition has cracks, and we're probably likely to see those cracks sort of, you know, expanding over time. One of the first things that sort of, you know, how that manifested was over the issue of H-1B visas at the very beginning well, even before Trump was inaugurated, the sort of Steve Bannon, you know, position that we should not be bringing in more skilled immigrants versus the Elon Musk sort of Silicon Valley position that we do in fact need that source of immigrant labor. Fritz, I actually teed you up to talk about the Chevron deference, so I want to give you a chance to talk about that. You know, Govind explained the revocation of doctrine that gave federal agencies discretion, and also pointed out, again, really interestingly, that there's paradoxically actually disempowers some of what the Trump administration might want to do. So in terms of environmental regulations, how do you see some of those contradictions playing out?
Well, the irony is they don't need to overturn Chevron now because they are going to do it by administrative action, or as much as they can. So the great concern was that, as Govind very accurately described, is that historically the courts have given considerable deference to the experts in government, knowing that Congress can't possibly know enough to all the technical issues that we're talking about. It takes, you know, in fact, we spent a lot of time at a school like this training people how to think analytically and what kind of knowledge you need, et cetera. And I worked in Congress, and I can tell you, anyway, I won't go there, but, you know, so it's important. But of course, if you look at the people at EPA and elsewhere in the administration, it's not as if they are wanting to regulate things and are going to be precluded from doing it now. It's the opposite. So that's an interesting twist on it. I did want, if I could, you know, I know it's not the question you asked me, but just to pick up on a theme I think running through this and really introduced by Eileen is the geopolitics of this and the way in which on issue after issue, as we in the United States withdraw either from the trade agreements that we have or from the norms that have governed how we deal with trade to the global health system, to rule of law and on migration, to rule of law and the law of war, and of course into climate change. This is, at one level, the world will go on without us. And Eileen made this point in the trade arena, but in other arenas as well. What is happening is because we're increasingly not present, there's a vacuum, or unreliable or untrustworthy. This leads countries, actors around the world, to want to deal with us less in all kinds of ways. And this is certainly telling in the business arena, where businesses abhor uncertainty. Similarly, nations. And why does that matter? Well, for all its flaws, the U.S. has benefited enormously from being a central actor, if not the only actor, in a global system for a long time. And I think we won't know what we've lost until we've lost it in a lot of ways. And what you're seeing, China in particular, but other countries as well, the entire BRICS apparatus seeking to create an alternative world order with features that we don't necessarily want, or that's not really in my view, not just in the interest of the United States, but in the interest of peoples around the world, frankly, and the climate, since I'm talking about that. And so I think this is, to me, this visceral response to any kind of international institutions, any kind of international norms. This extreme, America First policy is not only destructive at the global level, but in the end is going to come back to bite us in lots of different ways.
Thanks, Fritz, for kind of pulling that thread out from the conversation. I think, as we've sort of hinted at, the dismantling of the U.S. Agency for International Development is sort of a perfect, manifestation of that. And it's effectively a huge gift to China and other, potential adversaries on the global stage. Rebecca, I wanted to kind of turn to you for the last comment, and then we'll take some questions before wrapping up. To kind of one of the other sort of reactions to, a sense of, shock and awe at the national level, a sense of, at the global level, fatigue with the United States and a desire to sort of turn away, is that on the sort of silver lining, perhaps, if we can find one, is that the local becomes more important, right? And, in as much as we are going to see sort of migration actions being taken against our fellow community members here in the Denver metro, we also have local officials who have kind of stated and have acted to push back against some of those things. And Mike Johnson is a perfect example of this, the mayor of Denver, who has agreed to testify before Congress as one of the 4 mayors, I think, who represent the so-called sanctuary cities here in the United States. Tell us about that and how you see it.
Hey, I'm going to cheat first and mention 3 really important things that I didn't get to because I think they're really important. So one, again, was also the pause on the refugee resettlement program. But I also want you to think, if you don't see the common thread here, Google who he's thinking about opening the program up to first. And I'll just leave it at that. The other is, again, that similar invasion rhetoric to justify shutting down asylum entirely at the border, which courts have struck down before, which Biden was also being sued by the courts for. But the few little legal avenues he had are also being shut down. So right, it's actually making people more available to create that idea, right, of the criminal immigrant by removing, right, any sort of protections that people had in any sort of way to come in. The other is, again, using that same rhetoric to justify sending armed troops and the revision of the use of force down at the border and the military, which is really problematic considering the amount of abuses that have already happened with Customs and Border Patrol. What this really dangerous connotation is, it also opens up for the Insurrection Act. And it talks about that as part of the act being reviewed. And having the military engage in domestic law enforcement has been hugely problematic, and I'll just put it out there, the last time this was done in the US was after the LA riots. And so again, thinking about the precedent this sets in general to declare an emergency and to suspend rights more broadly. And so getting into the local, I also have some Know Your Rights cards out there if anybody wants to grab them. There's also stuff in this executive order, and I believe Chicago and Illinois have already been targeted about being not just being deprived federal funding, but also being sued for not complying. This has happened before, and I believe the last time the courts did side with the states. We'll see what happens there. We've also had Phil Weiser be pretty firm, and Colorado will stand by its laws. But there's a lot of pushes in the legislature to roll back the laws that we have. And I think, in some ways, sanctuary is a little bit of a misnomer. This idea that, we don't comply. In fact, that's not true. It's really about that not using local and state law enforcement for what should be federal immigration's job, right? That's their job. That's not how we should be using our resources. There's a lot of research that it actually decreases public trust in local law enforcement, leads to crimes being underreported. So there's a lot of benefits of having those laws that we do. And in fact, many argued when all of Colorado opted out of detainers in 2014 that they were unconstitutional, because this idea that you can't hold someone from ICE's requests, right, on a civil immigration detainer, waiting for them to pick them up when they've already complied with the terms of their sentence, right, or posted bond. So there's also legal hurdle, I think, issues that can come about from that. And so, we'll see what happens, but I think I'm also a little bit apprehensive because I've seen also some of the public opinion shift, right, even in the Denver metro area. I think it's a very powerful racialized scapegoat for real problems that people are facing. And so, I think there's also, lots of great organizations and people who've risen up kind of within the legislature, also in city council, that hopefully will kind of keep Colorado, right?
Yeah. Thanks, Rebecca, for pointing out, importantly, the racialized and indeed xenophobic aspects of certainly the immigration issue, but I think that cuts across many of the things that we've been talking about. If everybody will indulge me with 5 extra minutes, I apologize. There's a lot to say, as you can see. We would love to hear from all of you. Katie has a microphone in the back there. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, offer a comment. We would be grateful if you would be brief, and we will go through down the line. We'll take a round of questions from the audience or comments, 1 round effectively, and then we'll ask all of our panelists to pick up on whatever theme they'd like to respond to. Please, if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Sure. My name's Sarah McCarthy. I live here in Denver. Two quick questions. One is, I'm confused that we seem to be interchanging the use of immigrant and migrant. And I thought they were 2 very different things. A migrant can be a U.S. citizen from the get-go, born in this country and can be a migrant, versus an immigrant who comes across the border legally or illegally. The second one is my understanding that when the federal government awards a grant, it signs a contract. How is it that the federal government is not upholding its contract? It's services are specific, time is specific. How is that not being honored? That's it.
Hello, my name is Tori. I'm a DU student, and I was just curious if you have any insight into what the Trump administration is using as a justification for all of its health-related and data-related decisions.
I have a really quick question for Eileen on what your thoughts are on the Trump and Melania coin and the SEC's role in holding Trump accountable and the potential for corruption and fraud in the U.S. financial system and its impact on wealth inequality here and globally.
I have a question for Rebecca. So here locally, we've had issues with Mayor Mike Kaufman of Aurora in conflict with Mayor Johnston, and then Governor Polis having to get involved as well. And so just kind of how we can make sense of kind of these local issues that are very much, even in the metro area, kind of splitting people and splitting city governments, and how Johnston going to Congress and testifying makes sense in terms of like not necessarily inviting any kind of weird scrutiny to come down on a local level.
I just want to get you guys' opinion on what you make of Trump firing a board member of the NLRB a few days ago, and if you even see him reappointing someone to that board, because it's the whole agency is effectively gutted right now from any meaningful.
National Labor Relations Board, right?
Yeah,
Just to be clear.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. This is kind of a broad brush question. I'm Andrew Collier. I'm a fellow at Harvard focusing on China. 8 years from now, can we think of any positive attributes of the Trump presidency? I know this is going to be a tough question for this particular panel, but I could think of two. One is the reset of the dialogue about China. You could be pro or con, but that dialogue had to happen. And the second one is a focus on distributional issues that perhaps have been ignored by both Republicans, Reagan Republicans, and the Democrats over the past 20 years.
My name's Stephanie Locke. I'm a doc student with the School of Social Work. I was curious if you have any suggestions or recommendations about how to impact our sphere of influence or direct action that we can take.
Thank you so much for those really wonderful questions and for being less verbose than we were. I'm going to come down the panel. Eileen, Rebecca, Fritz, and Govind, please take whichever of those questions. Some of them were addressed to you directly. And if you would also, just as you're wrapping up, please address Andy's question, which I had intended to ask at the very end. What silver linings are there that we might hold on to? Eileen.
Sorry, lots of interesting questions. I'll just speak to a couple of them. To the question on the stopping of payment services and how that can happen, what does that mean? The way the Doges come in to the Treasury and other agencies and just shut them down, stop all sorts of payments that on programs where the money has been legally allocated by the Congress. I mean, it violates the rule of law. It's against the law to do that, but yet it's happened. And of course, now it seems like the new terrain on which Trump politics is being fought is through the court system. And I'm somewhat encouraged by the fact that there are so many court cases now pending that relate to so many of these actions that have been taken over the last 20 plus days. In terms of the Securities and Exchange Commission and regulation of finance question that Johnny asked about, he raised a couple of things. There was the crypto coin that was launched by both President Trump and Melania Trump. That was, of course, a very weird thing to have a president and the first lady launch a coin, a cryptocurrency coin, just on the hope that it would be a kind of pump and dump scheme, as people use that phrase to describe the cryptocurrency market in general. And it was quite successful in that regard. People did buy those coins up, and the Trump family made quite a lot of money very quickly. The rest of the cryptocurrency industry hoped to ride that wave. In fact, they didn't, but President Trump and Melania did. In terms of regulation of that industry, of the crypto industry, of course, President Trump received a lot of backing from the cryptocurrency industry. That was really fascinating to see those crypto bros mostly get behind Trump so strongly. They remain behind him. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the main regulatory body that governs the stock, bond, and other financial markets in the U.S., did have a cryptocurrency unit that had 50 staff members. And in fact, they've all been reallocated to other responsibilities. So no one in the SEC is now looking in on the crypto industry. And of course, that's an industry that is already tremendously opaque. It is wrought with all kinds of market gaming, pump and dump schemes. And so that's likely to happen more. So beware if you're interested in that industry. Other regulatory bodies that govern our financial sector have also seen some important changes. Michael Barr, who's on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, also had the role at the Federal Reserve of being the vice superintendent for financial supervision, essentially the person who ran the stress tests to test the capital standards of U.S. banks. He stepped down from that role, not wanting to complicate the operations of the Federal Reserve at a very complicated time for the Federal Reserve. He's still on the Board of Governors, but he did not want to be a political distraction because he knew that his role as vice supervisor of banking was going to complicate Jerome Powell's role. So he stepped away from that responsibility. One other point I'd make more generally, we're likely to see tremendous financial deregulation going forward. We know that in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2008 to 2015, there were very modest financial regulations that were put in place to try to prevent the worst excesses that led to the global crisis from occurring, like the Dodd-Frank legislation, which has been steadily stripped of its power. But what we know is that the folks that President Trump has put in place at various regulatory agencies, to the extent that they continue to exist and be staffed, are looking to strip away those regulations, which increase the risk and the vulnerability of the financial sector in general. I'll just note that one of the most important financial regulatory bodies has also been put on pause. That's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was created in 2011. That's 3 years into the global financial crisis. It was created to be the kind of police person over financial fraud. It had a juridical role. It recovered, since it was created in 2011, $20 billion for consumers that were victims of financial fraud, excess fees by their credit card companies, by their mortgage companies, for example. And like USAID, the lights went out on the Consumer Financial Protection Board over the weekend. And so that, of course, also does not speak well of financial stability and financial transparency going forward. Last thing on finance, President Trump has been a bit unclear on this issue. There is a major tax loophole called covered interest, which is essentially a tax loophole that transfers a tremendous amount of tax it gives tax abeyance to people in the private equity industry, which is a very important corner of the global financial sector. They've had a giveaway for a very long time under the covered interest rate provision. President Trump wanted to repeal covered interest. The financial sector pushed back, and now he's rethinking that, and it's still in place. So that's very important. In terms of the positive aspect, which was something that Andrew raised, it is difficult to find silver linings at the present moment, but in fact, I am inclined by temperament and in terms of the research I do to look for openings and silver linings, even in dark times, as many of my students here know. I would say that one point that Andrew made is exactly right, and that is to say that Trump's America, I think, does force the Democratic Party to really take inequality seriously and to rethink the kinds of commitments that partly contributed to the class resentments that made Trump attractive to a much larger proportion of the population. And so I think that's a reset that we needed. The other thing that I would say, and something that I've written about in some recent work, is that we might think about pushback coming not just from the courts, of course, but also from a coalition of the willing in the global community. There are many global actors, many nations that I think do provide opportunities for important kinds of changes in economic policies that promote sustainability and equity in a more just world. And so whereas I'd like to see the US at the center of those conversations for the next several years, we probably won't be, but there may be a coalition of the willing around the world, or at least in parts of the world, in international organizations, among some heads of states, and from civil society actors. And I think those become increasingly important going forward. Thanks.
I'll try to answer both of the questions. So for the first question, right, it depends if you're thinking about domestic, right, migrants or immigrants or international. Migrants is generally people still on the move versus immigrant or an international immigrant is someone who's living right outside their country of birth. But it's important that there's actually no legal kind of juridical category for a migrant versus a refugee or asylum seeker. But even with that, I think it's really important to really critically think with the labels we use and what they're actually reflecting, because it's often used very kind of politically to sort of say, like, we're concerned about these people, right, and not about others. And this is something we even saw in Colorado with a lot of attention being said, well, we're going to call people newcomers, right, which gives a signal of welcome, right? But then we think about some of the tensions and feelings that those have been long organizing with non-citizen Coloradans, right, who've lived here for most of their lives, for whom there's still, right, no solution for, right? And so we think about that in terms of labels as well. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is many of the laws that we either have for a very long time or the ones that have been kind of altered over time don't specify between migrant or refugee or asylum seeker, or even between forms of temporary protected status. They talk about non-citizen. And this is really, really concerning because we've had actually the proliferation of categories other than citizenship, right? All these kind of temporary forms of protection, which we saw can easily be taken away with TPS. Even back to laws in 1996, where it's much easier to get deported, right, for very minor infractions for any non-citizen, including people who are actually green card holders. Many people don't actually know that, right? So I think really thinking about also the ways that we have defined and started to strip away citizenship, and I think the birthright citizenship order is just, the kind of prime example of that, and really thinking of those issues and how we define that. I'll go to the next question in terms of Aurora. Aurora is a really interesting context. Many call it the sort of like global mini city, right? There's over 130 languages, I think, spoken in the schools, but has often had a very different bent, right, to its city council than the population there. But I think there's also something to be said about the fact that the federal government basically left it to states and localities, right, to play, make people, really vulnerable people, into pawns, right, and pit cities against one another, which can create really real strains, right? If you think about how much money, right, Denver invested, Aurora is zero. They even tried to criminalize nonprofits that were assisting migrants. It got to that level last year. But there's also a lot of organizing happening in Aurora right now. So again, a lot of this is going to happen on the streets, right? If we see public opinion. And it's also because Aurora was made a national example out of, which I think is really, really harmful, because I think it really deflected from real issues in Aurora, you're thinking about actual violations of tenants' rights, right, that were happening there, actual issues of crime and safety, where when you have raid an apartment complex, are you really instilling safety or trust in law enforcement in that community when its primary victims are members of that community? Not sure that's the best way to do that.
I'll try to be. I'll be very brief. Just quickly on the NLRB. I don't know the specifics of that case, but it's part of a pattern of not appointing people to various places. So I was just talking with some of the Peace Corps. They don't have a replacement. The Millennium Challenge Corporation. These are. We can go down a whole list of things. The technique of just not appointing, and even more generally, ombudspersons, persons throughout the government whose job it is to have oversight. And you mentioned one particular, Eileen, but throughout the government, and even more generally, the ability to peer into these institutions. So lack of transparency of data, et cetera, all making it more difficult to have oversight and to constrain the actions of the government. In terms of, I too, in terms of the question about the reset and positive things that could happen, I do think it's hard to make predictions, as they say, particularly about the future. I mean, there's a lot that could happen here, a lot of unintended consequences, and things will get shaken up. I agree with Eileen that one of them that maybe is more predictable, because you can already see it happening, is a conversation happening in the Democratic Party as it seeks to regain power, recognizing that it lost power for a variety of reasons, but one of them probably having to do with inattention to the plight of others. China, I think, is complicated. What happens, so many different scenarios of what could happen over the next period of time. But in general, resets can be good. And I made the point earlier a little bit that we don't know what we want till we've lost it. And so there'll be a clarifying moment. And that goes to the whole question of direct action, I think, in ways in which we can in all of our capacities. I spent a lot of time trying to think in my particular role, what can we do here at a school, at the Corbell School, each of us in our own ways. I think the main thing is to recognize that we all need to do something. Because right now, the shock and awe has got us, there's a kind of stunned reaction right now, and that's the purpose of shock and awe, is to stun. And so I think, we need to be thoughtful about it, but we also need, wherever it is we sit, to speak up, to join, to engage, maybe internationally, maybe even quite local, hyper-locally. There are lots of things we can do, but the worst thing is to do nothing, I think.
First, answer briefly the question about the data and health-related policies. I think my best understanding of what is going on is, interestingly to me, and actually I think this cross-cuts, especially in immigration, the vision of folks who are either actings or in charge of these agencies now strikes me as very much a view of, oh, we get a lot of discretion as unelected bureaucrats, not what they call themselves, but as unelected bureaucrats to sort of do what you want with agency power, which is contrary to a different vision where, no, if there is statutory or regulatory language saying you give the American people this information, that's your job. That's not something that you enjoy discretion to do or not do. So it's interesting to me that, and I think an avenue to push on, when I think about, for instance, what's going on with immigration, it's the sort of big government program of having completely unaccountable bureaucrats making very personal decisions about people, and yet people sometimes seem not to see it, through that lens, which I think is really interesting. With respect to silver linings, I want to push back a little bit in that I think that too much credit is given to Trump about the plight of the least advantaged. I actually think if you look at Romney or Reagan or George W. Bush, in terms of actual programs, they did a lot. You look at the child tax credit, which was something that Romney was for in the Senate. That did a lot more, I think, for people who are economically disadvantaged, or a Medicare Part D, for instance. Then now there's a difference between actual programs and marketing, and I think one big question that's going to come up is: are you going to see big legislative pushes to do something like raise the Medicare age to 79 or cut Medicaid dramatically? I've seen both those things talked about. Those would have huge and economically disparity increasing impacts. I think the silver lining to me would be if folks can figure out ways of talking to, I think this has been a strength for President Trump, is talking in ways that are compelling or understandable to people who are not, university professors. And I think that to the extent that I hope that civil society and other groups will take up the mantle of, for instance, calling out why something like, block granting Medicaid or, some of these changes to Medicare would be so harmful to poor people, that they find ways of making that statement in ways that are clear and understandable and not clouded in jargon.
One thing I've been reminded tonight more than anything else is how wonderful having a serious and thoughtful, if sobering conversation is, and certainly preferable to doom scrolling. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. And thank you all for granting us that extra 15 minutes and for being in community with us. And I'm sure any of us would be happy to stick around and chat. Stay warm out there, be safe, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.